Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I'm the director of the Kennan Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our book talk on Putin's turn to the East in the Xi Jinping era. While most attention has been focused on Putin's aggression in Ukraine, the big story of the past decade has been the reorientation of Russia from Europe to Asia. Centered on China, but not limited to it, this abrupt shift made possible Putin's anti-Western behavior. So today, to discuss this very important shift in global affairs, we have two experts. The first expert who will be talking and describing the book is Gilbert Rozman, who is the Emeritus Musgrove Professor of Sociology at Princeton University. He will be joined by his co-author, Gaye Christoffersen, who has taught at Johns Hopkins University and other institutions as well. So, a reminder for our online audience, you can submit questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org or via Twitter at Kennan Institute or on our Facebook page at any time. Anyway, we are very pleased to have our distinguished speakers, and I will turn the floor over to Gil.
Thank you, Will. It is a pleasure to be back at the Wilson Center, where I, some years ago, worked on a book on Sino-Russian relations called The Sino-Russian Challenge to the World Order. That has materialized in a very substantial way, and for the last few years, I've been working on the Russian transition since Putin reassumed power in 2012 to Asia, how Russia has reconsidered its push towards Asia. I'm delighted that Gaye has joined me in this endeavor, and we brought in a few people to contribute to the book, but it's mainly two authors who've put together 80–90% of a book. We trace the last 10 years. We look at 7 different geographical orientations, many dimensions of transformation in Russia's thinking, and this is part of a 4-book project. The book on South Korea's wild ride over the last 10 years is already out. There'll be a book launch later this fall for that elsewhere in D.C. The book on Japan's tremendous transition over the last 10 years has been accepted for publication, will be out next year, and the book on China's transition over the last, under Xi Jinping, including China's Russia policy, is 1/3 done. Chapters are appearing in the ASAN Forum of the ASAN Institute, and we will take them offline when we get to the point of having a book next summer. So that's the overall project, and now let me go into some detail on what we've learned based on following Russia's thinking. How have we done it? Well, every 2 months, I post called a Country Report Russia, with 20–25 Russian articles on Asia interpreted, summarized and interpreted. So altogether, since 2013, over 1,000 articles have been summarized by me, and trying to pick the best Russian materials, and it's turning out that there's really interesting material. Censorship does not prevent fascinating discussions of differences of opinion, of different orientations to what's going on. In the 1980s, I worked on Soviet views of China, and I also found then the most interesting debate in the Soviet Union before Glasnost was the Soviet debate on China. And you could see who was writing under which pseudonym, what interesting things were coming out, and I followed that with a Chinese book on the Soviet Union and have been carrying this project forward for a long time. So let's consider what I've found from this wealth of material. Along with other authors, we've used 5 or 6 languages of East Asia to get the really ground level insight into what's going on. So we start with the notion that there are 4 periods of thinking in Russian discussions of Asia. And there are 2 different kinds of discussions. They're summarized in different chapters. On the one hand, there's the mainstream discussion. Never has there been a better, more perfect union than Sino-Russian relations. And they are united on huge themes, ideological, geopolitical, so on. And then there's a separate chapter on the debate inside Russia, which says there have been lots of troubles. They can't criticize Putin. They can't criticize Xi Jinping. They can't say that Sino-Russian relations are not doing well, but there are all kinds of issues they can raise about what is troubling the Russian turn to the east. So the first few years of this turn were before the Crimean takeover, was a period of multipolarity. Russia was thinking broadly about what that turn would be. It would build up the Russian Far East, help develop that economically. It was a very high goal. It would include improved relations with Japan and South Korea, both of which were wooing Putin in those years. It would reach out broadly, but there was always a China-centered #1 goal. And so that period was largely favorable for the debate in Russia. They weren't criticizing the strategy very much because there were so many possibilities. It seemed to accomplish many goals at once. And then you get to post-2014 war invasion, and there's a new phase which is emphasizing docking with China. By that they mean the Eurasian Economic Union and China's Silk Road economic belt would achieve an integration based on transportation networks, based on economic activities. Central Asia would become a point of both sides working together. This was the ideal, and there were some thoughts in Russia about huge projects that would come about through this effort. But now you can go to the dissidents, the people who were looking at what was really going on. It wasn't long before they said, docking isn't working. The Chinese are not giving us what we thought they were going to give us at the May 2014 Putin-Xi summit in Beijing, which is supposed to be a transformative event. They began saying, we've got some problems here in a variety of ways. Meanwhile, there was still a pursuit of Japan. Abe and Putin had this relationship going, personal names and hopes, and the Japanese were particularly hopeful. There was hope for South Korea until the THAAD deployment in early 2016, where South Korea suddenly looked like an enemy from Russia's point of view. But nonetheless, this was a period of mixed results. But by and large, this is where we see the cat and mouse game picking up. Putin announces one strategy for Eurasia. Xi Jinping announces a different strategy. They don't coordinate on these strategies. And so the Silk Road economic belt is really not what Putin had in mind, and Putin has to adjust to it, accommodate. He accommodates more and more over time. The third phase is Russia readjusts and says, okay, we're going to achieve a greater Eurasian partnership, a wide scope of Asia. So they're saying, we're not going to just be with China. But in the meantime, they're downplaying the U.S. allies, and the #1 country for them is India in this, plus some importance in Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam. And so they have this notion, but China's notion is quite different. China approves the Eurasian Partnership, but it also has in mind, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, with which Russia is quite wary about. Russia doesn't join, although you know that Putin walked hand in hand with Xi this week or last week in approving the Belt and Road Initiative, but nonetheless there's been a lot of tension. So this was a time where their tensions are mounting in the cat and mouse game, and the agreement is intensifying on the grand strategic triangle with the United States. So now they're, particularly after the North Korean diplomacy collapses with the Hanoi summit, Russia and China are more strongly supporting North Korea. They're more hostile to the U.S. and its alliances. China is beginning to take advantage of that. And the Russians are getting nervous in these scattered articles describing problems that are existing in the relationship. Russians are nervous about not being allowed in the Chinese history museums that talk about the history of Sino-Russian relations or Soviet relations. They're nervous about China's reaction to an anniversary of the city of Vladivostok, which the Chinese have a different name for, and the Chinese were angered by the Russian celebration of the 160th anniversary of the city's founding by Russia. There are a whole series of discussions of Chinese arrogance. But nonetheless, the overall tone at the top is stronger and stronger quasi-alliance talk. Putin is drawing closer to China, and the Russians are delighted that China-U.S. relations are deteriorating fast in the late 2010s. So now they think, we've got a problem. We've got this tremendous relationship with Russia, but we can't really get China, we can't really get China to go along with what we're doing in Asia. And a shock to Russia of considerable proportions was the Chinese aggression in the Himalayas against India in the summer of 2020. Since Russia counted on India as its next partner after China, it talked about RIC, the Russia-India-China triangle, troika, which was coined by Primakov in the 1990s. By the way, if you're interested in RIC, today on the ASEAN Forum, we posted a set of 3 articles in introduction looking at RIC from the Russian, Indian, and Chinese perspectives. So we now get Russia nervous and yet more gung-ho about its relationship with China. Where does that take it? Where is it going to go? It now thinks that China is sufficiently angry with the U.S. and focused on Taiwan, that China needs Russia more, but it doesn't have that kind of equality in the grand strategic triangle that be taken seriously, because China really is disrespecting Russia. It's moving in its own way. They're not working closely together. So what's the solution for Russia? They could turn away from China, not a possibility given their ideology, given Putin's personal ties. They could join China more fully as a kind of junior partner and recognize it, or they could try a war in Ukraine to show the Chinese that Eurasia represented Russia's strong resurgence, and that Ukraine war would prove that Russia was an equal partner in the triangle with the United States. So that, of course, fails miserably, and we're in the last stage. And this time we see Russia and China coming closer together because of the war, as we've seen just recently. And yet China is now taking more advantage of Russia, whether it's the Northern Sea route, where Russia has to yield more to China, which it didn't want to do before, or Central Asia, which Gaye will discuss. It's now becoming a much more unequal relationship. And the Chinese sources don't hide the fact that Russia is a weakening country. And that means Russia is not going to do much in Central Asia. China is filling the vacuum. So it's the deference to Russia that used to exist is fading. I'll stop there, and Gaye will take over.
Thank you, Gail. My contribution to the book was basically 3 chapters, all of which were empirical case studies. And so the first chapter I'd like to mention was the chapter on the CSTO, which Putin had created and nurtured. And he actually hoped that China would join it. So for many years, Putin has tried to get China to join the CSTO, which is basically the former Soviet states. At the end of 2021 and early 2022, there was some Chinese discussion about joining it in terms of managing Afghanistan. Since the United States had pulled out, how could Russia and China jointly manage Afghanistan if they were, or the CSTO, could they do that, and would China be part of it? And some Chinese liked the idea, and some other Chinese thought that the CSTO was not really equipped to manage Afghanistan, and China wasn't really ready to join the CSTO. In terms of Putin's prestige and influence, the CSTO was a very public and sudden demonstration that the CSTO would not do what Putin had asked them to do, which was he wanted all of the CSTO countries to participate in the Ukraine war, and all of them refused to. I was mainly interested in Kazakhstan, but the other countries didn't, and Armenia didn't, which is very interesting. Belarus, they allowed Russian troops to go through their territory, but they never actually, as far as I know, they never actually sent soldiers to the Ukraine war. Although I did read that Belarus civil society and citizens did volunteer for the Ukraine side. So this was a very public exposure of just how much influence Putin did not have in Central Asia in particular. My other chapter on Central Asia was titled Central Asia Over a Decade, the Shifting Balance in Central Asia Between Russia and China. So Gil has already talked about the BRI and the Greater Eurasian Partnership. And China created a division of labor. They called it the Central Asian Great Power Division of Labor, where Russia was supposed to be in charge of security and China was in charge of economics. And this was meant to put some guardrails on their competition and to ease Russian fears about Chinese moving into Central Asia. Supposedly, they could coexist that way. What this overlooked, as Beijing and Moscow tried to manage their joint hegemony over Central Asia, it really overlooked the agency of secondary states, and especially Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has a multi-vector diplomacy. They have a lot of strategies. It can be hard or soft balancing, blackmail, leash slipping, neutrality binding, bandwagoning in regional organizations, and reaching out to the United States and Europe and the Middle East and Turkey, as well as China. And actually, I saw this in operation at the Astana International Forum, which I was very lucky to get invited to. I was surprised at the number of Europeans there and also the number of Middle Easterners that were there. A few Chinese, and I don't know if I saw very many Russians at all, and there actually weren't that many Americans either. But it was an amazing display of just how many international friends Kazakhstan has. And I thought that was the purpose of the Astana International Forum, was to demonstrate to Putin that Kazakhstan has friends, that it's not part of the Russian world, because Putin had been talking about Kazakhstan as part of the Russian world, part of the Russian sphere, not really a nation state. And he was using the same narrative that he had used on Ukraine. So that's my interpretation of Astana International Forum. Plus, it was really fun. It was really exciting because there were so many panels going on, and I got to talk about the geopolitics of rare earth. something that Kazakhstan probably wants to start selling to the United States, although I think they already have investment there. But certainly they have Chinese and Russian investment as well. So that is their example of multi-vectorism. But China in 2021 had started to assert what they wanted was an exclusive relationship with Kazakhstan under the BRI. And they were pressuring Astana. The foreign minister demanded coordination between their development plans, and the vice premier demanded better implementation of all the agreements they were signing. And this is something that we see over and over. Xi Jinping requests that BRI countries coordinate their policies and their planning with China, which usually means align your policies and your planning with China. And I guess they felt that Kazakhstan wasn't doing that sufficiently. And there were some China experts in Kazakhstan who were a little bit worried. They were worried they were becoming too dependent on China as China became increasingly assertive. In other words, they thought the assertiveness of China was related to the dependence of Kazakhstan. So the interaction between Beijing and Moscow generally doesn't give too much attention to middle powers like Kazakhstan. It doesn't really pay attention to what they want. It's more what Beijing and Moscow want. And we can see this at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2022. Putin and Xi try to coordinate their position that they're going to have at the SCO and present a unified leadership. And Putin was hoping that the SCO would enhance the image of Russia's leadership in Central Asia. But it actually diminished it instead, that the leaders that he was meeting kept him waiting. He was not greeted at the airport by the Uzbek leader. Xi Jinping had a lot of concerns that he voiced publicly about what Putin was doing in Ukraine. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the CSTO members refused to participate in the invasion of Ukraine. So all in all, he didn't feel it really, his leadership didn't feel really enhanced by the SCO meeting. But possibly the most serious thing was that Xi Jinping promoted China's Global Security Initiative, which was promoting China's security leadership in Central Asia. And that was a violation of the division of labor that they had had up to then. And so some Central Asian analysts said that the division of labor was fading, that Russia is not doing its job anymore. It has shown that it is unable or unwilling to protect the region. In fact, Putin got some criticism from that from countries such as Tajikistan. So the Samarkand Declaration that came out of that meeting talked about all the member states thought that Central Asian countries were the core of the SCO, and that challenged the presumed leadership of China and Russia. And they promoted mutual respect for sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, all of which was kind of an indirect criticism of what Putin had done in Ukraine. The other conference was called the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia, which is called CICA for short. Kazakhstan actually initiated this organization 30 years ago. And in 2022, Kazakhstan hosted CICA. What the president of Kazakhstan was trying to do, Tokayev, he was trying to elevate the stature of CICA to make it an Asian OSCE. So Putin tried to hijack the CICA summit. He brought in his old golden billion conspiracy theory about the United States. He asked the CICA countries to ignore the sanctions that were on Russian oil exports. He implied that CICA was part of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. He linked up the SCO and the Eurasian Economic Union, and said that Beijing and Moscow had drafted a statement on security, which they expected the SICA members to approve. I never really saw that statement. I don't know that it got published, and nobody talked about it after the SICA meeting, so I have to assume they didn't approve it, but Moscow didn't talk about it after. So he also discouraged multi-vector foreign policies. Putin did not like that. And his statement on security was considered irrelevant. So Tokayev had no bilateral meeting with Putin. He created a new format called the 5+1 format, where all the Central Asian countries meet with Putin together. So in a one-on-one format, then Putin is always the dominant person, the dominant country. But in the 5+1 format, then there's greater collective heft in dealing with Putin. So this is Tokayev's preferred way of meeting with Putin. But actually, I think it was Tajikistan that said that they didn't like this format. They didn't want to do it this way. They wanted to go back to the old ways. They wanted more of a patron-client relationship between Putin and Tajikistan. So basically, SICA, and I don't think SICA got very much coverage in the Western press at all. It's been around 30 years, and I think most Americans haven't heard of it. It demonstrated that there was some greater agency by Central Asian states over their foreign policies, and they seem to be rejecting a Sino-Russian joint hegemony. But I think the most serious problem in 2022 is this shifting balance of power where China starts to very slowly and gently take on a security leadership, and therefore they're challenging the division of labor. My third chapter was titled The Russian Far East and China's Northeast, a decade in the shadow of the Belt and Road Initiative. So this, talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, incorporating the Russian Far East and the Chinese Northeast, actually, this is a very old strategy that goes back to the 1980s, where China, or maybe Heilongjiang, I would say maybe Heilongjiang. Heilongjiang wanted to create a natural economic territory between the Northeast, we call Dongbei, and the Russian Far East. And that had been resisted by local Russians. Yeltsin was okay with that. You know, he was busy doing other things, but the local Russians were very resistant to any kind of economic integration in the early 90s, especially. The turn to the east has been met very skeptically by local Russians. Moscow intellectuals wrote 6 volumes of something called Towards the Great Ocean. So the first one came out in 2012, about the time of Russia's hosting of APEC 2012, and the 6th one came out in 2019. And this is supposed to be the definitive statement of what turn to the east means. You know, if you wonder, what does it mean? You read 6 volumes of Towards the Great Ocean. But some intellectuals in the Russian Far East, very skeptical. For example, Victor Larin, he talked about turn to the east, and he said, might seem real to Kremlin dreamers, but here on the shores of the Pacific Ocean, these are taken as simply another experiment using ritual words, not resulting in economic development. So the Russian Far East is very used to plans that come from the center but don't get implemented. They're very used to that. So, of course, they're taking a very jaundiced view of the latest plans. However, there have been organizations that have been created in the Russian Far East, such as the Ministry for Economic Development of the Russian Far East and many other organizations, which would facilitate Russia's presence in the Asia-Pacific. Chinese, such as Zhao Huasheng, thought that the turn to the east is basically Russian Eurasianism, that it's an ideology. And some Russians have tried to say that there can be some sort of synthetic integration of Russian Eurasianism and Chinese Sinocentrism, but actually there's no compatibility at all to that, none in the least. So this Heilongjiang strategy of trying to integrate Dongbei and the Russian Far East, which had been in existence now for, well, 30 years, more than 30 years, then got incorporated into the Belt and Road Initiative and became the most important project in Russia's role in the Belt and Road Initiative. However, progress has been very slow. They've come up with several five-year plans for integration, and the first one was very badly implemented. The second one, we're still in the middle of it. It goes from 2018 to 2024, and we haven't really seen what the outcomes of that are. What I would argue, though, is that China is building a very different state on the border than what Russia is building. China has something called the five-year plan for making the border prosperous, and it builds a lot of infrastructure, roads, telecommunications, villages, promoting commerce. Russia, for the most part, they rely on border guards, they rely on Cossacks, but they don't have this kind of state building on the border the way China does. So I would say they're building their state in reaction to each other, but they're building very different kinds of states. China wanted very much to be an Arctic country, and most of the world didn't really accept China as an Arctic country, but they called itself a near Arctic country. And eventually, initially Russia was very skeptical of China's role as a near Arctic country. They wanted an equal partnership with Russia in the Northern Sea route, and they wanted to call it the Polar Silk route. And Russia was not going along with that. But slowly but surely, maybe because Russia has become more dependent on China, or maybe we would say more compliant on China, they have slowly accepted that. And now the Ministry for Economic Development of the Russian Far East has "and the Arctic" attached to it, because China considers the Russian Far East its route to the Arctic. And initially, the Chinese were very annoyed because they wanted to send ships through the Northern Sea route as international waters, but Russia insisted that a Chinese ship would need a Russian ship escort, and the Chinese would have to pay a fee. So that the purpose of that is to make it clear to the Chinese that it's not an equal partnership, it's Russian territorial waters. And if you want to go through it, you have to pay the fee. Now, everyone says that at the 2017 Belt and Road Forum, Putin shifted and became more enthusiastic about the Belt and Road. And that's when he hoped that China would connect the Northern Sea route with the Belt and Road Initiative and incorporate it, China would be incorporated into the Arctic. Heilongjiang has been a major driver of all of this because it sees itself as a logistics hub. It doesn't have seaports at all, but somehow it talks about a strategy of borrowing ports to go to sea. And the ports they're borrowing are Russian ports, and those ports are being reached by high-speed rail, Primoria 1 and Primoria 2 railways. So I think we're running out of time. The Ukraine war has not gone over very well in the Russian Far East, and a lot of Putin's allies have mysteriously died. But the most interesting death was Colonel Vadim Boyka, who was in charge of mobilization for the Ukraine war in Vladivostok. He died very mysteriously. He was shot 5 times in his boss's office in November 2022, and it was ruled a suicide. So this person had to shoot himself 5 times to commit suicide. No, it's not funny at all, but I'm sorry. It's peculiar. There was a lot of peculiar deaths of Putin's allies, which gave me the impression that the Russian Far East didn't like the Ukraine war very much. So now they're doing a joint construction of the Polar Silk Road in the Arctic, and out of this has come a discussion of a maritime partnership. And Dmitry Trenin has talked about it. I think Zhao Huasheng has talked about it. And now this maritime partnership is evolving, which is an indication of Russia giving way to Chinese preferences. And also, originally Russia was very reluctant to get involved with China's maritime territorial disputes. But lately, in the last few years, they've been having joint flyovers and maritime drills. For example, in 2019, they had the flyover over the Sea of Japan and the Dokdo Island. So what we see is Moscow is becoming much more compliant to Chinese preferences than they were before. And I think with that, I better stop.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm going to begin with 2 questions to each of our speakers, but a reminder to our online audience that you can submit questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. And for Gil, I want just to have you talk a little bit more about Putin's latest trip to China and whether he accomplished any of the goals that he set out when he went to China, or was he kind of an extra guest by the Chinese, who was really not a part of the Belt and Road Initiative and not a part of the conference? And for Gaye, if you can just briefly talk about the notion of the division of security between Russia and China, most notably in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, and basically the evidence that Russia doesn't really have as strong of a military as most people thought.
Okay, I'll answer briefly so we can get a lot of questions in. I don't think Putin succeeded in this trip. He didn't get the symbol that many were talking about, the agreement on the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline that would have added a lot of weight, making this trip significant. But what he got was symbolism, and this is typical of Xi Jinping's approach to Putin. Give him the symbols of success. Make him seem as if he really is very important. Take this relationship as extremely meaningful, and substantively give very little and drive hard bargains. And we don't know what the bargaining is at this point.
And Gaye, about Ukraine and security.
Ukraine and security. Well, I think that I think China's challenge in Central Asia with the Global Security Initiative, I think it's focusing mainly on non-traditional security, working up to traditional security. And it's a typical Chinese incremental approach, a little bit testing the waters, moving a little further, testing the waters. So it's not a direct challenge immediately. China is very hard-pressed to figure out why Ukraine happened. Why did Russia invade Ukraine, and what was the benefit? And they've readjusted their assessment of Russian capabilities. And you can see that somewhat in writing. There was a lot of Chinese debate, actually, about how to assess this Russian invasion of Ukraine. And surprisingly, some Chinese Russian specialists were critical of Russia. But Russia does have its supporters in China. I think there's a former military attaché who had been in Beijing, Moscow for a long time, and he's now a researcher, and he writes a great deal about, he even promotes an alliance between Moscow and Beijing. But he's in the minority, not the majority. He does, the Chinese assessment of the world has changed quite a bit, that Russia is much weaker than the Chinese thought it would be, and the West is much stronger and more unified than the Chinese thought they were. They do talk incessantly about creating a new world order and having a leadership role in that new world order. And they base that on the global majority, which are the countries that did not observe the sanctions. So they are interpreting those countries who didn't follow the sanctions to be supporters of Russia. But that's not necessarily the case. There may just be countries that want to import oil from Russia, but they don't necessarily support Russia at all.
Okay, we don't have any questions online yet, but so are there any questions in the room? Right here.
Hi, my name is Dan. I'm with the Kennan Institute. So I had a quick question. I may have missed this. Should I just talk out loud?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things I'm interested in is kind of this, there's a lot of public confusion about what the BRICS initiative is, and now it's expanding, and like, what does this mean? It seems like there's a divergence in how Russia views and markets the BRICS initiative compared to how China or maybe India views it. Seems like Russia has this vision of like, that this is like some zero-sum economic project that, you know, kicks the West out of its dominant position. But it seems like China and India kind of take a more muted approach to this as one of many projects that they're a part of that kind of demonstrate their growing economic clout. So do you think that maybe Russia is like hyping this up, or is that maybe not the case? Is it this genuinely kind of, do they share a similar view of this project?
No, I think this is one of many examples of the architecture of regionalism, or broader than regionalism, that they don't share a similar view of. Russia is the most enthusiastic for BRICS and for RIC, R-I-C, within BRICS, with the core of it. China sees this as an opportunity for leadership in the global South. It's pushing hard. Russia is really a secondary factor for China in this, or this is China's overall agenda. And India is competing with China to lead the global South, and it has to be involved here because they see this as a means, now an expanded BRICS in particular with the 6 new members, as a means to shape the agenda. They can't be left out of it. It would have happened without India, and so they participate, but they have a different approach, having in this year become very active in trying to lead the global South, with a tremendous encouragement from Japan and now from the United States as well, from September. So I think there is this, you're absolutely right, BRICS is just an example of different ways of thinking. Same bed, different dreams.
Right here.
Hello, Marek Mnkishak, Center for Eastern Studies, OSW Warsaw. Question which seems logical based on what you have said very interestingly about the Russian options, which they seem to have, and decided to go for a war as a partial way to improve their standing vis-a-vis Beijing, which has obviously failed. So what they left with, and what's your prognosis about this? Because it seemed to be pretty logical that what they left with is basically to go along with this asymmetric relationship, which is growing asymmetric due to technological dependence, economic dependence, which is growing in a current situation. But do you think that it may given all those reservations you've mentioned within the previous debate, create certain tension within the Russian elite, which is not happy with basically this kind of development. And obviously, even if this debate could not be probably public, because it does not be really safe for people to speak openly, but this tension, I can imagine, may grow in future. So, what's your prognosis? How this be developing, and what could be a potential impact on internal situation in Russia? Thank you.
I don't think the Russian establishment, and certainly not the community of analysts, have reconciled to secondary status to China to a great degree. It's coming step by step. They're more accommodating to it, but there's still some tension over it. And there are articles, very interesting articles this year, that talk about alternative regional architecture, resume efforts to deal with other countries. Now, the idea that they can somehow get China and India to reconcile, which was very popular a few years ago. The idea somehow this is their hope. Of course, they needed it, but it wasn't happening. So there's not much of that anymore. They can't do. But there's still some that amazingly suggest maybe Japan and South Korea have a different outlook than the United States. And maybe there's some way of rebooting relations with them, although I haven't said much about it, but it's fascinating how Russia really damaged its relationship with both countries that were so interested in trying to find ways to improve relations with Russia not many years ago. So that is another approach. And then there's the question of what do Russians do when they see China behaving and speaking in a fashion that they are offended by. They call it Chinese arrogance, and that is not diminishing. And so there is some backlash, some outcry, but rather submerged. And so those are the possibilities for trying to deal with this issue when the reality is Russia's options narrow further and further.
Okay, so we are getting some questions online, and the first question asks, are the Central Asian states concerned about too much Chinese influence considering what China is doing in various parts of the world?
Okay.
Okay, yeah. Yes, they're very concerned, and that is why Kazakhstan has a multi-vector diplomacy to try to draw in other areas such as Europe, the United States, Middle East, because they do feel there's too much Chinese pressure to align with China, to align their policies. But each country would probably behave differently. Kazakhstan would be the largest country. There's some poorer countries that probably have less capacity to resist. I remember a Tajik economist, it was a conference, a Slavic Studies conference in Japan, and she asked me, what should Tajikistan do? And of course, I'm not an expert on what Tajikistan should do about China, but I did say, well, Kazakhstan made up its own plan before it negotiated with China in the Belt and Road, and probably Tajikistan should also create its own plan, decide what your priorities are before you negotiate in the BRI. And actually, I think they did with the help of the World Bank or some other international organizations, which is what would make sense. But Tajikistan needed more help, possibly, than Kazakhstan did to do that. So each Central Asian country is very different.
Right here.
Thank you. I'm a reporter with South China Morning Post, and I have a question. to what extent do you think Xi Jinping's alliance with Putin is about Taiwan, is related to his possible invasion, the possible invasion of Taiwan? Thank you.
I think Taiwan is a big factor, just as Ukraine has been a big factor in Putin's thinking. And as both leaders became more intent on acting more quickly in dealing with these problems that, for their perspective, that helped strengthen the relationship a few years ago. I think it's still a factor. But I think something more fundamental is going on between Russia and China. I think there's a legacy from the period of peak communism, where they still think in many of the terms that existed from that period. And Russia is the country for China that gives it the most possibility of achieving its agenda, even achieving Sinocentrism, although Russia isn't too keen on Sinocentrism. So I think it's much deeper than Taiwan, Ukraine, but that's certainly important.
We have a question online, and the question concerns what kind of challenges are facing Vietnam in this asymmetric relationship between Russia and China?
Well, I think Vietnam is trying to keep, like India, is trying to keep Russia as a partner. Arms deals, since they have some more leverage, they can maybe drive a little wedge between China and Russia. So I think the challenges are pretty considerable. Both have been tilting towards the United States in important ways. India maybe more than Vietnam, but I think they both are still holding up hope that they can keep Russia from joining China completely.
Michael.
Thank you. Michael Keyes from the Kennan Institute. I used to be the State Department's Consul General in Vladivostok, and so I really greatly appreciate this and agree wholeheartedly with what you said. I was wondering, since you mentioned North Korea, I was wondering how you both assess which country has greater control over or influence over North Korea, and how they might use that in the coming years.
This is something I've been working on. Last time I was in China before they denied me a visa 19 years ago was up the border near North Korea, looking at Chinese sources on North Korea. I'm keenly aware of this. I think China has greater influence by far, but Russia at various times has moved to take advantage of China's greater pressure on North Korea. So in 2017, China was putting quite a bit of pressure on North Korea with the resolutions it signed and sort of pressed Russia to sign at the United Nations Security Council. So that China and Russia have not been fully coordinated on North Korea. They've been competing to some degree. Russia tries to build up its influence at various times, even in 2003. I saw some signs of that. But overall, China wields a much greater clout, and Russia has generally been willing to play a secondary role. Now, with the new situation since July, with the arms deals, things have changed in ways I can't yet predict.
The next question comes from Adam Blanco, and he asks, what do Russian technocrats think about the tilt to China, such as Gref or Matushkin?
Russian technocrats. Well, there's been concern over the years that Russian elites were generally not very interested in the turn to the East. In the first phase, the notion that opposition was mainly from people who were used to dealing with the West. Some were called even Europhiles. But the technocrats' position has been weakened. Their views aren't so easily expressed in the writings that I come across. I think there's a certain amount of nervousness, but I don't have a good way of analyzing that.
Gaye?
I should think the technocrats would be concerned about China borrowing or taking technology from Russia, especially in military technology, but that goes back a long ways. They've been doing that for decades, really. But we don't hear very much from the technocrats, so it's hard to say what they're thinking.
So Gil mentioned the idea of the New World Order that both China and Russia talk about occasionally. And they have both basically advocated for a multipolar world. But does Russia and China really have an alternative to a world order that can actually promote growth and stability?
They haven't spelled out the full dimensions of a new world order. It's more what they're against. And in favor of currency has been a big deal, using de-dollarization and strengthening the hold of Asia and building up the global south and changing international institutions. But if you go to more specifics, I don't think they share a notion of what that world order is. What is more interesting for me is not the world order where they can agree wholeheartedly on doing something against the existing liberal international order, US-led, but the regional order where they have both tried to come up with schemes for that, claim that they're working consistently, and yet are not at all.
Right here.
Also at the Wilson Center. China is still wooing the Europeans for economic and technological cooperation, but the Europeans are, of course, very much at loggerheads with the Russians. Doesn't that complicate China's tilt towards Russia? Are they, because of Europe, less or more restrained than they would otherwise be?
Yes, certainly that. And that's just, it's also true of Japan and South Korea. China's position towards them is not that they're unfriendly countries the way Russia says. And so there are lots of differences like that. In fact, one of the negative features from China's point of view of the Ukraine war is the Euro-Pacific cooperation, what China calls NATO of Asia with European partners. This bothers the Chinese a lot. That's one of their many losses because of this war. But China, of course, still is trying to improve economic ties with Europe quite a bit.
Any last questions? Right here.
Is it okay if I stand up? Or
Yeah.
Hi, how are you? My name's Alf. I'm just curious to know how much of this new push towards the east from Russia is dependent on Putin and Xi, and like what would happen in a decade or so if one of them exits the stage? How much of like a bottom-up foundation does this relationship rest on?
Well, if you say, are the Chinese and Russian people understanding each other, working well together, they have good cultural contacts, is there a lot of trust? My answer is no, and Gaye has seen many examples of this. Is public opinion in each country oriented to the notion that they're in dangerous times, supportive of each other? Yes, pretty dramatically so. If Xi and Putin go, who is likely to replace them? I don't see many indications in Russia that Putin's departure, unless there's a dramatic loss that shakes things up greatly, will lead to a more technocratic, pro-world integration approach. But maybe that's the only outcome that would help save Russia. But in China, there seems to be some debate, particularly if the economic circumstances change, about what they're losing by siding so much with Russia and what may need to do in order to build up the Chinese economy in more difficult circumstances.
I think that if Putin were to, say, pass away or something, they'd still have something called the turn to the east, but they would redefine it. Maybe not tell us they're redefining it, but it would expand beyond China, that it wouldn't just be focused on China the way it has. If you think about the institutions that they've built in the Russian Far East, those are for economic relations with the Asia Pacific, not just China. In fact, they're definitely focused more on the Asia Pacific. And there's still a lot of Russians in the Russian Far East who would prefer Pacific Russia have a much broader view of the Asia Pacific and not just be China dependent. Yeah.
So, go ahead, you get the last question.
One question, which is definitely a niche question. Professor Rozman, you spoke about, I think some Russians were aggravated by Chinese history museums. I visited the major museum in Changchun about the whole Far East. I thought the museum totally whitewashed anything that Russia or the Soviet Union ever did in that area. So I'm just wondering what aggravates the Russians.
If you visited the museum, it's probably not the museum that Russians are excluded from.
No, they could go, anybody could.
Right. I'm saying there are a lot of museums where they can't get in, and in Heilongjiang and elsewhere, and they talk about the history of course, Tsarist imperialism, unequal treaties, still showing the map from China in August 28th showed a territory in Bolshoi Ussurisk that was demarcated in 2004 as Chinese after China already gave up the land to Russia. It was a shock to the Russians and so on. So there's a lot going on in history that is creating potential for trouble.
That is fascinating because, you know, it sounds like you have another book there, the underground museums of China.
I haven't been there. I can't do it.
He's already working on one book. I don't know if we can suggest another.
I would include the Nanjing Museum to the foreign volunteers during World War II. Basically, they're flying tigers from the United States, but there were Russian volunteers that hardly anybody knows about.
Absolutely, a lot.
Right, and the exhibit there, when I saw it in 1981, I don't think there was any mention of that. But in the past 10 years, they've expanded that Russian exhibit. Actually, it was several years ago, it was a pretty big exhibit, and then it got smaller. So I think it expands or contracts according to.
But again, that's a museum for the common people, the one you saw.
Yeah, the common people, but it's also recognizing Russia. It's also recognizing Americans or not. You know, it's, you know, as I say, it keeps shifting around. And there were 2 Korean volunteers also, so they include them. But there were thousands of Americans.
Okay, with that, we're going to bring our discussion to a close. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and a special thanks to the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States for co-sponsoring today's event. The last good news about this event is that there actually are going to be books for sale. And so we're only accepting cash, as I understand.
That's right. It's $30.
$30, but if you can come up to the podium, we're happy to make some sales. So thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to having you at future Kennan Institute events.